On the morning of January 15, 1919, Boston woke beneath a brittle winter sky. The city was still learning how to breathe again after war. The Great War had ended just 2 months earlier, and the docks along the North End hummed with a tired, cautious optimism. Soldiers were home. Factories were shifting. The world felt unsteady, but hopeful. And over Commercial Street, there was a smell. It was thick. Warm. Sweet. Molasses. For years, the people of Boston's North End had lived with that smell. It drifted from the massive steel tank owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, a hulking cylindrical structure that loomed over the waterfront like a careless god. Children dipped sticks into leaks that ran down its sides. Dockworkers joked that if you leaned close enough, you could taste the money. The tank stood 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, and held 2.3 million gallons of molasses, dark, viscous syrup imported from the Caribbean. Molasses was not just a sweetener. In wartime America, it was fuel. Alcohol distilled from molasses was used to make munitions and industrial ethanol. The tank was part of the machinery of modern war and modern profit. But the war was over. And the tank was full. The night before January 15 had been bitterly cold. Temperatures had plunged below freezing. Steel contracted. Molasses thickened. Then, just as suddenly, the morning warmed, rising to over 40 degrees Fahrenheit 4 degrees Celsius. Inside the tank, the molasses began to expand and ferment, producing gas. Pressure built quietly, invisibly. There had been warnings. Workers had heard ominous groans from the tank for years, a deep metallic creaking that sounded like a living thing shifting its weight. Leaks were so common that the company painted the tank brown to hide them. No engineer had ever properly tested it. It had been rushed into service in 1915, built too quickly, too cheaply, during the frenzy of wartime demand. Safety was an afterthought. At approximately 12:40 p.m., the city went about its lunch hour. Firefighter George Layton sat in the Engine 31 firehouse nearby, enjoying a quiet moment. Dockworkers walked toward the piers. Housewives prepared midday meals. Children were released from school and wandered the streets. Then the tank made a sound no one had heard before. A deep, thunderous metallic roar tore through the North End, described by survivors as a machine gun burst mixed with the groan of a collapsing building. Rivets shot through the air like bullets. Steel plates buckled outward. And then the tank exploded. Not with fire, but with motion. A wave of molasses, estimated at 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, burst into the streets. It was not a splash. It was not a spill. It was a wall. Buildings were ripped from their foundations. A freight train was lifted off its tracks and folded like a toy. Telephone poles snapped. Horses vanished mid-step. People were knocked off their feet, swallowed, pinned, drowned. Molasses filled basements, crushed wagons, and smashed storefronts. The syrup was thick and heavy, far denser than water. Those caught in it found their movements slowed instantly, as if trapped in quicksand. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. Witnesses later said the screams were brief. A dockworker named Michael Sinnott was thrown against a wall and buried up to his chest. He survived only because rescuers reached him quickly. Others were not so lucky. Firefighter Martin Clancy was trapped beneath debris and suffocated. Children were found days later, preserved grotesquely in hardened syrup. The air was filled with the sound of collapsing structures, breaking glass, and something else, an eerie silence where screams should have been, swallowed by the weight of sugar. Boston's first responders arrived to a scene that defied comprehension. Firefighters waded through molasses that hardened as the day cooled, their boots sticking with every step. They used seawater to wash victims free, salt cutting through syrup where fresh water failed. Nurses improvised stretchers from doors ripped off buildings. The harbor itself turned brown. By nightfall, the city realized the scale of what had happened. 21 people were dead. More than 150 were injured. Entire blocks of the North End lay broken. And yet, even as bodies were pulled from the wreckage, a question hung in the air, heavier than the smell that now coated the city. How could something so ordinary, so sweet, cause such devastation? The answer would expose not only a failed tank, but a system built on haste, profit, and disregard, one that had turned a food product into a weapon. The cleanup would take weeks. The lawsuits would last years. The scars would linger for generations. But in that first hour, as Boston stood ankle-deep in syrup and shock, no one yet understood that this was not merely an accident. It was a disaster foretold. The first minutes after the explosion were chaos without language. Those who survived the initial wave struggled to understand what had struck them. There had been no fire, no earthquake, nothing familiar enough to name. Only impact, weight, and darkness. Molasses poured into mouths and noses, clogging breath, sticking eyelids shut. Survivors later said it felt as though the city itself had turned liquid and hostile. Firefighter George Layton was among the first responders to reach Commercial Street. What he saw did not resemble a disaster scene so much as a grotesque parody of one. Buildings leaned at impossible angles. A freight car lay twisted against a warehouse wall. Horses, still harnessed, were frozen mid-fall, their legs trapped, their bodies slowly sinking as the syrup cooled and thickened. And everywhere, the color. Brown coated everything, walls, windows, faces. It glistened at first, then dulled as the cold returned. Each minute that passed made movement harder. Molasses that had flowed like water at the moment of impact now resisted like glue. The firehouse itself had nearly been destroyed. Engine 31 had been pushed off its foundation by the force of the wave. Layton and his crew did not wait for orders. They tied ropes around their waists and waded in. They moved slowly, deliberately. One wrong step could trap a man to the knees, then the waist, then the chest. More than one rescuer had to be pulled back by rope when the molasses seized their legs. Firefighters used axes not to break doors, but to cut people free from hardened syrup. The cries came in bursts. Some were muffled. Some were weak. Many stopped suddenly. One rescuer recalled seeing a woman pinned against a wall, her arms trapped, her mouth just above the surface. By the time they reached her, she had already suffocated. The molasses had risen inch by inch, giving her time to understand exactly what was happening. Children were the hardest to find. They were lighter, easier to carry, but also easier to lose. Several had been walking home from school when the wave hit. Their bodies were carried into alleys, basements, and under debris. Days later, searchers would still find small shoes and coats embedded in the syrup like fossils. The Boston Police Department arrived alongside Navy sailors from the nearby USS Nantucket, who abandoned protocol and joined the rescue without hesitation. Soldiers, dockworkers, and ordinary citizens followed. There was no hierarchy in the molasses, only strength, endurance, and luck. Medical care was improvised on the spot. Hospitals quickly overflowed. Victims arrived coated head to toe in sticky brown syrup, their wounds hidden beneath layers of hardened sugar. Doctors struggled to clean injuries without reopening them. Some patients arrived in shock, their bodies cold from exposure, their lungs burned from inhaling molasses. Nurses worked until their hands blistered. The death toll rose slowly, unevenly. Some victims were pronounced dead immediately. Others lingered for hours or days before succumbing to internal injuries or infections. Molasses, it turned out, was an excellent medium for bacteria. As the rescue continued, a terrible pattern emerged. Many of the dead were found close to safety, near doorways, windows, or stairs. They had almost escaped. Almost. One man was found with his hand wrapped around a doorframe, his body trapped just inches from open air. Another had climbed onto a wagon, only for the molasses to tip it over and bury him. The disaster was mercilessly democratic. Dock workers, housewives, children, and soldiers were all claimed without distinction. But the poor suffered most. The North End was a working-class neighborhood. Many lived in old buildings that offered little resistance to the wave. Their homes became traps. As night fell, the temperature dropped. What had been difficult became nearly impossible. The molasses hardened further, turning rescue into excavation. Searchers used shovels, boards, and bare hands. Floodlights were set up, casting long shadows over a landscape that looked more like a battlefield than a city street. And slowly, the questions began. Why had the tank failed so completely? Why had it been filled to capacity so soon after the war ended? Why had no warning been given? Workers from the United States Industrial Alcohol Company arrived but offered little help. Some were visibly shaken. Others were defensive. The company issued a brief statement expressing regret, but avoided responsibility. Privately, executives worried not about the dead, but about liability. Rumors spread quickly. People spoke of leaks that had been ignored for years. Of rivets popping out under pressure. Of children collecting molasses dripping from the tank's sides. Of a structure that had never been properly tested. City officials began taking notes. Engineers inspected the twisted steel plates scattered like shrapnel. They noticed something immediately troubling: the steel was far thinner than expected. The rivets had failed catastrophically, not one by one, but almost simultaneously, suggesting structural weakness, not an isolated flaw. The tank had not merely broken. It had been doomed. As the second day dawned, the rescue shifted into recovery. Bodies were pulled free with increasing frequency. Each one was carefully recorded, cleaned as best as possible, and sent to be identified. Families gathered at makeshift morgues, bracing themselves for answers they already feared. Boston began to understand that this was not an act of God. This was an act of neglect. By the end of the week, the streets were still coated. Fireboats sprayed seawater into the city, washing molasses into the harbor. It took weeks to clean the area, and even longer to remove the smell. Locals would later swear that on hot summer days, decades later, the North End still smelled faintly sweet. But the true aftermath was only beginning. The victims' families wanted answers. The city wanted accountability. And the courts were about to become the stage for one of the most significant corporate negligence cases in American history. What had happened in Boston was not just a tragic accident. It was a reckoning. In the days after the streets were washed clean, Boston turned its attention from shovels to subpoenas. Grief hardened into anger. Anger demanded answers. At the center of it all stood an absence, where a steel colossus once loomed, now only twisted plates, bent rivets, and a scar in the earth remained. The molasses tank was gone, but its presence lingered in every unanswered question. And so, in courtrooms and committee rooms alike, the city began to put the tank itself on trial. The mayor of Boston ordered an immediate inquiry. Engineers, inspectors, and city officials were summoned. Newspapers published diagrams of the tank's design, scrutinizing every bolt and seam. Editorials demanded to know how a structure holding more than 2 million gallons of industrial liquid could be erected in a densely populated neighborhood with so little oversight. The public learned something unsettling very quickly. There had been no meaningful inspection. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, as it was commonly known, had built the tank in 1915 during the height of wartime demand. Molasses was not just sugar, it was profit. Fermented into alcohol, it fueled explosives and industry. Speed mattered. Oversight did not. The tank's construction had been rushed. It had never been filled with water for a stress test. No certified engineer had signed off on its safety. The man responsible for its approval was Arthur Gell, a company treasurer with no formal engineering training. That detail alone ignited outrage. Boston's newspapers seized on it, printing Gell's name in bold type. Headlines asked how a bookkeeper had been allowed to approve a structure taller than a 4-story building. The implication was clear: lives had been gambled for speed and savings. Investigators gathered the wreckage and laid it out like forensic evidence. Plates were measured. Rivets were catalogued. Metallurgists examined the steel under magnification. What they found was damning. The steel plates were far thinner than industry standards of the time. Some measured barely half the recommended thickness for a tank of that size. The rivets, meant to hold back unimaginable pressure, had sheared cleanly, leaving jagged edges that suggested brittle failure rather than gradual fatigue. The tank had not failed because of an unforeseeable catastrophe. It had failed because it was weak. Even more troubling was the way the tank had been used. In the days before the explosion, the company had pumped warm molasses into a tank already holding colder contents. The temperature difference caused fermentation gases to expand rapidly. Pressure built inside a structure already stretched beyond its limits. Workers later testified that they heard ominous groans and pops the day before the disaster. Some said the tank had begun to vibrate. Others recalled leaks worsening, streams becoming rivulets, rivulets becoming steady flows. No evacuation was ordered. No alarm was sounded. Production continued. By summer, more than 100 lawsuits had been filed against USIA by victims and their families. Rather than face them individually, the courts consolidated the claims into a single massive civil case, a legal maneuver that would become a model for future class action suits. At the center of the proceedings stood Judge Hugo Munch, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail and his skepticism of corporate defenses. He appointed a special auditor, Colonel Hugh Ogden, to oversee testimony, evidence, and expert analysis. For 3 years, the case unfolded. It became one of the longest and most complex civil trials in Massachusetts history. Witnesses took the stand by the hundreds: survivors, engineers, construction workers, city officials. Their stories overlapped and contradicted, but a pattern emerged: a portrait of a company that had cut corners systematically and dismissed warnings casually. USIA's defense rested on a single claim. They argued that the tank had been destroyed by anarchists. The timing, they said, was suspicious. January 1919 was a period of labor unrest and political anxiety. Bombings attributed to anarchists had occurred in several American cities. Why not Boston? Why not the molasses tank? Their lawyers suggested sabotage, perhaps a bomb placed at the base of the structure. The theory was eagerly reported in some newspapers. It appealed to a public already fearful of radicalism. It also offered the company something invaluable: distance from blame. But evidence refused to cooperate. No explosive residue was found. No witnesses reported a blast. The sound described by survivors, a deep roar followed by tearing metal, did not match an explosion. Engineers testified that a bomb powerful enough to rupture the tank would have left unmistakable signs. Colonel Ogden was unconvinced. In his report, he dismissed the sabotage theory as speculative and unsupported. The failure, he concluded, was structural and entirely preventable. The tank had been improperly designed, improperly built, and improperly maintained. The words carried weight. As testimony dragged on, the public followed every development. Courtroom sketches appeared in newspapers. Diagrams of rivets and stress lines were printed for readers to study. The trial transformed technical engineering concepts into household language. People began asking broader questions. Who was responsible for safety in an age of rapid industrial expansion? What did companies owe the communities they operated within? And how many other tanks, bridges, and factories were waiting to fail? The molasses flood had cracked more than steel, it had fractured trust. When the final ruling came in 1925, it was decisive. USIA was found liable. The company was ordered to pay $628,000 in damages, equivalent to many millions today. Families received compensation, though no amount could restore what had been lost. More importantly, the verdict set a precedent: corporations could be held accountable for negligence, even years after the fact. The molasses tank, silent and absent, had spoken through the law. Boston did not return to normal. New regulations were drafted. Structural engineering standards were tightened. Permits now required certified professionals. Industrial tanks were inspected, tested, and documented. The age of informal approval was over. The disaster became a case study in engineering schools. Students learned not just equations, but consequences. They studied photographs of twisted steel and read testimony from grieving families. The lesson was simple and brutal. Failure is rarely sudden. It is built slowly, decision by decision. The North End rebuilt itself brick by brick. Children grew up who had never seen the tank, never smelled the sugar, never heard the screams. But memory lingered, passed down in stories told on stoops and in kitchens. And somewhere beneath the streets, the earth still remembered. In the weeks after the trial began, long before a verdict could offer even symbolic relief, the people of Boston's North End were left with something far heavier than molasses. They carried absence. The flood had not only crushed buildings and bodies, it had rearranged lives. Entire families now measured time in before and after. Chairs remained empty at dinner tables. Shoes sat by doorways, never to be worn again. The neighborhood learned to live with gaps where voices used to be. The official death toll would eventually settle at 21, though some believed the number higher. Transient workers, sailors passing through, and undocumented laborers were difficult to account for. In a port city, not everyone was missed immediately. But every name that was recorded came with a story, specific, intimate, and irreparable. Among the dead was Mary Gallagher, a young woman walking to visit a friend when the wave struck. Her body was found days later, carried far from where she had been last seen. Newspapers printed her name once, briefly, then moved on. Patrick Breen, a laborer unloading freight, left behind a wife and two small children. He had survived the war years, survived dangerous dock work, only to be taken by something no one had imagined could kill. Giovanni Martinelli, an Italian immigrant, was crushed beneath a collapsing wall. He had come to America seeking stability. His widow spoke little English, but her grief needed no translation. These were not statistics. They were neighbors. The North End, dense with immigrant families from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe, absorbed the loss collectively. Funerals followed one another in rapid succession. Black coats became a familiar sight on narrow streets. Church bells rang so often they seemed to lose meaning, then regain it through repetition. Priests struggled to offer comfort for something so senseless. Unlike fires or explosions, the Molasses Flood left no dramatic ruins to point to once cleanup was complete. The tank was gone. The streets were washed. Life appeared to resume. But grief does not need spectacle. Children began asking questions. Why had their fathers not come home? Why did their mothers cry when they passed Commercial Street? Why did adults fall silent when the word molasses was spoken? Teachers noticed changes. Some children became withdrawn. Others lashed out. The disaster had taught them, without explanation, that the world could turn lethal without warning. Women bore much of the burden. Widows took in laundry, cooked for boarders, or returned to factory work. Older children left school to contribute wages. Survival replaced aspiration. The American promise felt thinner, more conditional. Yet the neighborhood endured. Neighbors shared food. Churches organized collections. Mutual aid societies, already common among immigrant communities, expanded their reach. What the company had failed to provide, the people supplied for one another. This resilience did not erase anger. It sharpened it. Survivors spoke of lingering effects. Some developed chronic coughs from inhaled molasses. Others complained of joint pain from being trapped in the cold syrup for hours. A few never regained full mobility. Doctors treated symptoms but had no framework for understanding trauma. Nightmares were common. Men woke convinced they were sinking. Women dreamed of walls collapsing inward. The smell of sugar, once comforting, became unbearable. Bakeries reported customers turning away at the door. The body remembered what the city tried to forget. Even those who had not been physically present felt changed. Parents grew more cautious. Dockworkers eyed storage tanks and silos with suspicion. Trust in industrial structures, so central to modern life, had been quietly broken. Boston had learned that danger did not always announce itself with smoke or flame. Sometimes, it arrived sweet and silent. As years passed, the Molasses Flood receded into history. New buildings rose. New families moved in. Children born after 1919 heard the story secondhand, framed as something strange, almost unreal. A flood of sugar, they would ask. Impossible, some said. But for those who remembered, impossibility had little meaning. They remembered the sound, the roar like a train tearing through the street. They remembered the cold, the weight, the way the city seemed to betray them. And they remembered how quickly attention moved elsewhere. The trial dragged on. Newspapers shifted focus. New crises emerged. The disaster became a reference point, not a headline. Yet memory persisted in quiet ways. A woman crossing Commercial Street slowed her pace. A man refused work near large tanks. An old dockworker spat on the ground whenever USIA was mentioned. The city had not forgotten. It had internalized. There would be no grand statue for the Molasses Flood. No towering memorial to mark where the tank once stood. The victims' names would not be etched in marble for tourists to read. Instead, remembrance lived in behavior. In stricter building codes. In engineers insisting on calculations. In inspectors demanding signatures. In the slow, bureaucratic rituals of prevention. The North End rebuilt not by erasing the past, but by absorbing its lessons. Loss, like molasses, had seeped into every crack. And once there, it was impossible to fully remove. The disaster had proven something deeply unsettling, that death could arrive through negligence, and that ordinary people would bear the cost. But it also revealed something else. That communities, even when crushed, could hold together. That grief, shared, could become endurance. That memory, even without monuments, could still guide the future. When the court rendered its judgment, the city exhaled, but the world beyond Boston leaned in. The Great Molasses Flood was no longer merely a local tragedy. It had become a case study, cited in engineering circles, legal journals, and municipal offices across the United States. The tank had failed spectacularly, but its failure illuminated a deeper structural weakness in modern society, the gap between rapid industrial expansion and the ethics meant to govern it. Before 1919, engineering in America was often informal, even improvisational. Many structures were built by rule of thumb, experience, or economic pressure rather than rigorous calculation. That era did not end overnight, but in Boston, it cracked. The court's ruling against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company sent a clear signal. Negligence could no longer hide behind complexity. Companies were responsible not only for profit, but for consequence. Legal scholars noted something new in the decision: the court did not require proof of malicious intent. It was enough that USIA should have known. That standard, foreseeability, would become central to modern tort law. In practical terms, this meant engineers could no longer claim ignorance. If a failure could be predicted by proper analysis, then failing to perform that analysis was itself a form of culpability. Engineering was no longer just technical. It was moral. Engineering schools responded quickly. Professors incorporated the Molasses Disaster into curricula. Students studied stress diagrams drawn from the tank's remains. They learned how internal pressure, temperature differentials, and material brittleness interacted, not in theory, but in blood and loss. The lesson was sobering. The tank had lacked sufficient safety margins. Its steel was too thin. Its rivets were brittle. Its design ignored dynamic forces created by fermentation gases. None of this required revolutionary science to understand. All of it required discipline. From that point forward, water testing became standard practice for large tanks. Blueprints demanded certification. Calculations were documented, reviewed, and signed. The idea that a treasurer could approve a structure of that scale became unthinkable. Slowly, method replaced haste. Municipal governments took note. Boston revised its building codes, requiring permits for industrial storage tanks and mandating inspections by qualified professionals. Other cities followed, often citing the Boston case directly. The concept of the building inspector gained authority. No longer a formality, inspection became an instrument of public safety. Inspectors were trained to look not just for visible defects, but for design flaws, those invisible dangers hidden beneath steel and concrete. Resistance came, as it always does. Industrial leaders complained of costs, delays, and bureaucracy. They argued that overregulation would stifle innovation. But the image of drowned streets and buried children proved difficult to argue against. Safety had acquired a face. Within corporations, the disaster changed internal conversations. Risk management, once an afterthought, became a discipline. Engineers gained leverage in boardrooms. When they raised concerns, executives listened more carefully. The molasses tank had demonstrated a brutal truth: shortcuts could be expensive. Companies began documenting decisions, creating paper trails that could be reviewed, audited, and defended. This transparency was not altruistic, it was self-preservation. But its effect was real. Engineering ethics codes, still in their infancy, gained urgency. Professional societies emphasized responsibility to the public. Engineers were encouraged, even obligated, to refuse unsafe work. For the first time, walking away became an act of professionalism. Yet the legacy of the disaster extended beyond formal institutions. It reshaped how ordinary people thought about infrastructure. Citizens began asking questions at town meetings. Newspapers scrutinized industrial projects. Communities demanded explanations. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. The molasses flood taught the public to see infrastructure not as neutral, but as political, shaped by decisions, budgets, and values. A tank was no longer just a tank. It was a choice. And choices, as Boston had learned, had consequences. By the late 1920s, the disaster had faded from headlines. New tragedies took its place. But its influence remained embedded in process. Every time an engineer double-checked a calculation. Every time an inspector rejected a permit. Every time a company delayed production to test a structure. In these moments, the tank spoke again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But persistently. The city that had been buried in sugar had given the modern world something rare, a clear example of how failure could instruct, how loss could shape responsibility, how memory could be translated into method. Boston paid dearly for that lesson. Others would benefit. As decades passed, the Great Molasses Flood slipped from lived memory into something stranger. It became a story. Not the kind preserved neatly in archives or footnotes, but the kind reshaped by repetition, told on front stoops, in classrooms, in bars along the harbor. Facts remained, but they softened at the edges. Details blurred. What endured was the image, a city drowned in sugar. And with that image came disbelief. By the mid-20th century, new generations struggled to take the disaster seriously. A flood of molasses sounded absurd, even whimsical. Tourists laughed when they heard it. Children giggled in history lessons. Late-night radio hosts mentioned it as a curiosity. Those who remembered did not laugh. For survivors and their descendants, the humor felt sharp, misplaced. They understood how easily tragedy could be diminished once its witnesses were gone. The molasses flood had become a punchline to people who had never smelled death beneath sweetness. Yet myth thrives where distance grows. Stories expanded. Some claimed the molasses reached second-story windows. Others said people were trapped for weeks. A few insisted the harbor turned brown for years. These exaggerations did not erase truth, they layered over it, creating a folklore that carried emotional weight even when details faltered. The disaster had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just history. It was legend. One story persisted above all others. That on hot summer days, the North End still smelled like molasses. Scientists dismissed it. Time, weather, and reconstruction had removed all physical traces. But locals swore otherwise. Taxi drivers mentioned it in passing. Elderly residents nodded knowingly. Smell is memory's most stubborn companion. Whether imagined or real, the scent became a metaphor, an invisible reminder that the past had not entirely loosened its grip. Even when unseen, it lingered. The city itself seemed to participate in remembrance. Writers and historians returned to the disaster periodically, drawn by its strangeness and significance. Academic papers cited it in discussions of engineering failure. Legal scholars referenced it as an early mass tort case. But popular culture embraced it differently. It appeared in trivia books, in newspaper anniversary columns, in documentaries that lingered on the surreal contrast between sweetness and death. Each retelling emphasized the same unsettling irony: something so benign, so domestic, had become lethal. That irony ensured the flood would never fully fade. The danger of legend is distortion. As the story spread, it risked losing its core truth, that the disaster was not a freak accident, but a preventable failure rooted in negligence. When people focused only on how strange it sounded, they missed why it mattered. Historians pushed back. They returned to court transcripts, engineering reports, eyewitness accounts. They insisted on names, dates, causes. They reminded readers that beneath the molasses were real bodies, real families, real accountability. The flood, they argued, should not be remembered for its novelty, but for its lesson. And slowly, that perspective regained ground. The molasses flood endured because it occupied a rare space. It was horrifying, yet improbable. Well documented, yet hard to imagine. Absurd in description, devastating in reality. That tension kept it alive. Boston itself embraced the complexity. Walking tours mentioned it with a mix of humor and gravity. Museums contextualized it within industrial history. Schools taught it as both cautionary tale and human story. The city learned how to remember without trivializing. In the end, the transformation of the disaster into legend was inevitable. All history undergoes this process. What mattered was how the legend was handled. In Boston, the molasses flood became a reminder that progress without care carries risk. That stories, even strange ones, can hold warnings. That laughter and gravity are not mutually exclusive, but must be balanced. The tank was gone. The streets were clean. But the story refused to disappear. And perhaps that was its final function, not to haunt, but to caution. If you walk through Boston's North End today, nothing announces what happened there. There is no towering plaque. No sculpted monument casting solemn shadows. No clear line in the pavement marking where 2 million gallons of molasses once surged with lethal force. The city has rebuilt itself too well, too thoroughly. Progress has smoothed the scar. And yet, the absence speaks. The site where the tank once stood, near what is now Langone Park and the edges of Commercial Street, feels unremarkable. Children play baseball. Dogs chase balls. Traffic hums. Life asserts itself with ordinary confidence. But geography remembers, even when architecture does not. In 1919, the molasses tank was impossible to ignore. At over 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, it dwarfed the surrounding buildings. Its dark steel walls loomed over tenements and warehouses alike, a constant presence in daily life. Residents oriented themselves around it. Near the tank. Behind the tank. Across from the tank. It was not just infrastructure, it was a landmark. That is what makes its disappearance so unsettling. When the tank vanished, it left behind a void that could not be pointed to, only felt. The skyline adjusted. The eye found new anchors. But for those who remembered, the space never fully filled. They walked past it and saw something that was no longer there. After the disaster, the land changed hands. The industrial logic that once justified the tank slowly retreated from the north end. Warehouses gave way to parks, roads, and public spaces. The neighborhood became more residential, more open. This transformation was not accidental. City planners understood, even if they never said it aloud, that the tank could never be replaced by something similar. The land resisted repetition. Heavy industry felt wrong there now, as though the ground itself objected. So the city softened the space. Green replaced steel. Open air replaced containment. Movement replaced storage. The choice was practical, but also symbolic. People walk over the site every day without knowing it. Joggers pass through Langone Park at dawn. Parents push strollers along Commercial Street. Tourists take photos of the harbor, unaware that beneath their feet once lay hardened molasses mixed with brick, wood, and bone. History does not demand recognition. It simply exists. Those who know the story feel it differently. They slow down. They look around. They imagine the tank's shadow stretching across the street, the sudden roar, the impossible wave. The absence becomes a kind of presence. Some tragedies demand memorials. Others resist them. The Molasses Flood belongs to the latter. Perhaps because its cause was human error rather than war or ideology. Perhaps because its victims were ordinary people, not soldiers or leaders. Or perhaps because the city chose learning over lamentation. There was no ceremony marking the tank's removal. No dedication of space. No official act of closure. Instead, closure came through regulation, through law, through quiet changes in how things were built. Boston remembered by doing better. Urban historians speak of cities as palimpsests, layers of history written over one another. The North End is exactly that. Beneath its parks and streets lie stories compacted by time. The Molasses Flood is one of them. Its traces are not visible, but they are documented, in court transcripts, engineering textbooks, municipal codes. The geography holds the memory passively, waiting for those who care to look beyond the surface. In this way, the land becomes an archive. Not curated. Not explained. Simply present. To stand at the site today is to experience a peculiar dissonance. The calm is real. The safety is real. But so is the knowledge that these things were once violently absent. The lesson of the place is not fear. It is humility. Cities are fragile arrangements. Their safety depends not on optimism, but on attention. On choices made by people who may never see the consequences. The molasses tank once stood here because someone decided it could. It fell because they were wrong. And the empty space that followed became the most honest monument of all. The Great Molasses Flood did not occur in isolation. It unfolded during an age when industry was expanding faster than understanding, when steel and steam promised progress but often delivered catastrophe. Across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities around the world experienced disasters born not of nature, but of human haste. And yet, among these tragedies, Boston stood apart. The early 1900s were marked by confidence, almost arrogance, in engineering. Factories rose overnight. Railways cut through continents. Storage tanks, bridges, dams, and mills were erected to meet demand, not necessarily to last. Disasters followed with grim regularity. In 1907, a Quebec bridge collapsed during construction, killing 75 workers. In 1911, New York's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire trapped young women behind locked doors. In 1913, a fertilizer explosion devastated Apaw, Germany. Each event shared a common thread: warnings ignored, margins reduced, lives undervalued. Boston's molasses tank belonged to this pattern. But it also defied it. Most industrial catastrophes fade into statistics. Dates and death tolls replace faces. Causes are summarized, lessons abstracted. Over time, they become footnotes. The molasses flood resisted that fate. Part of the reason was its sheer improbability. Molasses was familiar, domestic, harmless in kitchens and bakeries. To imagine it moving at lethal speed through a city street challenged intuition. The mind lingered on the contradiction. But novelty alone does not preserve memory. What truly anchored the disaster in public consciousness was its clarity. The cause was not mysterious. The failure was not complex. It could be traced directly to decisions, specific, documented, human decisions. There was no storm to blame. No earthquake to excuse it. No enemy to condemn. Only negligence. That clarity made the story durable. Other disasters inspired mourning. The molasses flood inspired analysis. Engineers dissected it. Lawyers cited it. City planners referenced it. It became something professionals returned to repeatedly, not out of fascination, but utility. In classrooms, it was presented not as spectacle, but as warning. Students learned that equations without ethics were incomplete. That pressure calculations meant nothing if ignored. That responsibility extended beyond blueprints. The tank's failure offered something rare, a complete narrative arc, from design to disaster to accountability. Most catastrophes lack that resolution. Despite its relatively low death toll compared to other industrial tragedies, the molasses flood felt intimate. It occurred in a neighborhood, not a factory complex. Its victims were visible. Their homes were known. Their routines understood. The disaster invaded daily life. People were crushed while walking home. Children were trapped on their way from school. Families watched the aftermath from their windows. This proximity made the tragedy personal in a way large-scale industrial accidents often were not. Boston did not read about the disaster. It lived inside it. History is selective. It preserves stories that resonate with broader anxieties and lets others dissolve. The molasses flood survived because it spoke to enduring fears, unchecked power, invisible risk, ordinary places becoming deadly. It also survived because it produced change. Regulations followed. Practices shifted. Standards improved. Memory attached itself to consequence. Disasters that change nothing are easier to forget. Today, when engineers discuss failure analysis, the molasses flood is still mentioned. Not first, not always, but reliably. It has become a benchmark, a reference point for how small decisions can accumulate into irreversible outcomes. It reminds professionals that failure rarely announces itself. It whispers first. It leaks. It stains the ground. It gives chances to intervene. And when those chances are ignored, history takes note. The Great Molasses Flood sits among the long list of industrial catastrophes, but it does not blend in. It remains distinct, not because it was the deadliest, but because it was the clearest. A tank built too thin. Warnings left unheeded. Lives lost unnecessarily. Justice, eventually, delivered. In that sequence lies its endurance. The disaster became a lens through which later failures would be viewed, measured, and judged. It was not the worst. It was the most instructive. For those who survived the Great Molasses Flood, survival did not mark an end. It marked a beginning. The disaster had passed in minutes, but its consequences unfolded over lifetimes. Survivors carried the event with them, not as a single memory, but as a quiet presence shaping choices, fears, and silences. They learned how to live after something that should never have happened. Many survivors bore injuries that never fully healed. Broken bones set poorly. Lungs scarred from inhaling thick syrup. Joints stiffened by hours spent immobilized in cold molasses. Doctors treated what they could see. What they could not name was trauma. Long before psychology offered language for post-traumatic stress, survivors described symptoms that fit it precisely. Sudden noises triggered panic. Confined spaces caused breathlessness. Some refused to walk near large structures. Others avoided the waterfront entirely. The mind, like the body, had been reshaped. The flood altered careers. Dockworkers left the harbor. Teamsters refused routes near industrial storage. Some men abandoned physical labor altogether, seeking work that felt safer, even if it paid less. For women, the shift was often more subtle but no less significant. Widows entered the workforce out of necessity. Mothers became providers. Children grew up faster, shouldering responsibilities that reshaped their futures. Education was interrupted. Dreams narrowed. Survival dictated ambition. The flood did not discriminate in who it killed, but in who it burdened. It was precise. Many survivors stopped talking about the disaster altogether. Not because they had forgotten, but because memory hurt. The flood was not a story with a satisfying end. It offered no heroism, no redemption, only randomness and preventable loss. Silence became a coping strategy. Children sensed it. They learned which questions not to ask. Family histories developed gaps where the flood should have been. It was easier to move forward without reopening wounds. And yet, silence preserved the memory in its own way. What was unspoken gained weight. Some survivors chose a different path. They spoke often, insistently, as if repetition could give meaning to what had none. They told their children where they had been, how close they came to death, what they saw. These stories were not dramatic. They were practical. They emphasized caution. They warned against blind trust. They taught skepticism toward authority and respect for risk. In this way, memory became instruction. As survivors aged, the flood returned in unexpected moments. Anniversaries. Newspaper articles. The sound of metal under strain. The smell of sugar in unexpected places. Some attended court proceedings years later, not out of hope for justice, but for acknowledgement. They wanted the record to show that what happened mattered. That they had mattered. By the 1950s and 60s, few eyewitnesses remained. Those who did were elderly. Their voices grew softer. Their stories shorter. Time compressed memory into fragments. But the fragments endured. The final survivors died quietly, their passing unmarked by headlines. No one announced the loss of the last eyewitness. There was no ceremony. History closed the door gently. What remained were documents, photographs, and a city shaped by lessons it rarely named. The survivors had done what they could. They lived. The greatest legacy of the flood was not found in courtrooms or textbooks. It lived in the people who endured, and in how endurance changed them. They taught caution through example. They demonstrated resilience without romanticism. They carried loss without spectacle. Their lives testified to something essential, that survival is not triumph, but continuation. And continuation, sometimes, is the hardest task of all. In the end, the Great Molasses Flood did not leave ruins. It left questions. Not the kind that can be answered with dates or diagrams, but the kind that linger, quietly, persistently, long after the streets are cleaned and the witnesses are gone. Questions about how societies choose speed over care, profit over patience, confidence over caution. And what it costs when they do. The tank was built in an era intoxicated by progress. Industry promised abundance, efficiency, and modernity. Structures rose faster than scrutiny could follow. The future was assumed to be benevolent simply because it was new. The molasses flood shattered that illusion. It revealed that progress, unguided, could be as dangerous as stagnation. That innovation without responsibility was not advancement, but risk deferred. That engineering, divorced from ethics, was merely construction. Boston learned this lesson the hard way. Others learned it because Boston had. One of the most enduring lessons of the disaster is that responsibility is rarely abstract. It has names, signatures, decisions. It takes form in thin steel plates, untested rivets, ignored leaks. The tank did not fail because of bad luck. It failed because people chose not to look closely enough. That truth remains uncomfortable, and therefore valuable. Every generation faces its own tanks. Its own shortcuts. Its own warnings dismissed as inconvenient. The molasses flood reminds us that negligence does not announce itself as cruelty. It often wears the face of routine. There is no monument for the flood, but perhaps that is fitting. Its memory survives not in stone, but in systems, in building codes, inspection protocols, professional ethics. These are quiet memorials, invisible to most, but vital to all. When an engineer refuses to approve a flawed design, the memory is working. When a city demands proper oversight, the memory is working. When a company delays profit to ensure safety, the memory is working. This is how tragedy earns meaning, not through reverence, but through prevention. The most unsettling truth the flood offers is this: catastrophe does not require extraordinary forces. No storm struck Boston that day. No enemy attacked. No machine malfunctioned beyond expectation. A tank failed. Something ordinary became deadly because responsibility was neglected. That is the danger that endures. History cannot protect us by itself. It must be carried, interpreted, applied, remembered with intention. The Great Molasses Flood asks us not to marvel at its strangeness, but to recognize ourselves within it. To see how easily convenience can outweigh caution. How quickly warnings become background noise. How fragile trust can be when systems fail. It asks us to slow down. To inspect. To question. To care. In January 1919, Boston was buried in molasses. In the century that followed, it was shaped by what emerged from beneath it. Loss became law. Failure became instruction. Memory became responsibility. And that, perhaps, is the quiet power of the disaster, not that it happened, but that it was understood. Not perfectly. Not immediately. But enough.